At 7:10 a.m. on June 4, 1942, a B-26 Marauder peeled off its rendezvous and came down through the clouds to 200 feet above a glassy Pacific. 30 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros screamed over its back like a dark halo. On the horizon lay a quartet of gray silhouettes, 4 Japanese fleet carriers under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's command. The bomber's nose pitched down. For a handful of heartbeats, everything the men of Midway could see from their little island looked impossibly small. The carrier's flight decks were long, flat runways cutting the ocean. Sailors were tiny figures on those runways. The surf glittered under a sky that felt as if it might split open. The plane's name, stenciled on the nose, read Suzie Q. Its serial, 401391. Its pilot, First Lieutenant James Murray. Around him sat a crew patched together to do a job their aircraft was never built to do. The Marauder was a medium bomber, long known to crews as unforgiving. Navy torpedo squadrons earlier that morning had already suffered catastrophic losses. Yet here, in the earliest light, Army aircraft that had received minimal torpedo training now pointed their noses at the most powerful striking force on the planet. The image at the center of that morning, a lumbering bomber hurtling at masthead height across the flagship, would become one of the most cinematic moments of the Pacific campaign. It would be replayed in reports and retellings. It would be preserved in a single silver nameplate stripped from a battered fuselage and later placed behind glass. But the 3 seconds of the flyover are not the whole story. They are an apex formed by months of training, years of design choices, split-second decisions, and crucially, the terrifying arithmetic of wartime improvisation. The Marauder in that role was a misfit and masterpiece at once. Designed as a fast, medium-altitude bomber, it carried a dense wing loading, a lot of weight on a relatively small wing. That made it fast and efficient in cruise. At low speed, low altitude, loaded with fuel and ordnance, it behaved like a high-strung race car on a mountain pass. Precise control required constant attention. It had a reputation among crews. Some whispered the nickname Widowmaker in the same tone a man might whisper a warning about a cliff. For the mission over the carrier force, the B-26s were adapted hastily and imperfectly to carry torpedoes. Crews whose training had emphasized level bombing now practiced low-altitude approaches and releases they'd barely had time to rehearse. The manual tasks that made the difference in emergencies, cranking down landing gear if hydraulics were shot, feathering propellers to reduce drag after an engine was hit, would be executed by men who were, for the most part, not torpedo crews by trade. Inside Suzie Q, the routine of a combat sortie folded into quiet, precise labor. The pilot and co-pilot monitored power settings and enemy positions. The bombardier watched for release cues and water surface conditions. Gunners scanned arcs for closing fighters while attempting to stay clear of their own prop wash. These were not invented images. They are the functional geometry of a bomber crew under pressure. Names make the geometry human. First Lieutenant James Murray at the controls. Second Lieutenant Pren Moore at his side as co-pilot. Second Lieutenant Russell Johnson at the bomb site. Staff Sergeant John Gogoy, Corporal Frank Malo, and Private Earl Ashley manning guns. The plan that morning was straightforward in the terms given to it. Reach the fleet, approach low, launch torpedoes at an exposed carrier, force the Japanese to respond, inflict damage if possible. The odds were not in the attackers' favor. Earlier attacks by Navy torpedo squadrons had been met with heavy fighter interception and dense anti-aircraft fire. The B-26s would cross more ocean to reach their targets, and they would do so in aircraft whose primary design mandate had not been the torpedo run. Takeoff from Midway before dawn, the climb into gray light, rendezvous amid scattered clouds, the long, silent run across blue miles. The approach folded reality into a narrow calculus of speed, altitude, and timing. Zeros were a constant hazard. Anti-aircraft from the carriers lanced up in bursts, orange puffs exploding into the sky. The carrier's own fighters, ready on deck, turned toward the attackers. Tracer lines stitched the air when they could find targets. Those tracer lines and flak were not evenly distributed. Ships present different silhouettes to attackers depending on approach angle, and their batteries had firing arcs with blind spots created by the geometry of the ship and the placement of friendly aircraft in rigging. In some cases, the close proximity of friendly aircraft on deck, the lines of fuel and ordnance being moved, and the necessity to avoid shooting down one's own planes constrained how quickly certain guns could be brought to bear with maximum effectiveness without risking catastrophic friendly hits. It is a point of tactical nuance that helps explain why a daring low pass could have an outsized psychological effect, even when it did not tell the whole tactical story. As Muri's formation closed, the Marauder's controls grew heavy with speed adjustments and the constant flak of anti-aircraft bursts. The pilot trimmed as he pushed his machine into the descent. The sky narrowed to a corridor. Altimeter readings dropped: 1,000 feet, 600 feet, 300 feet, 200 feet. Ahead, a carrier, Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, loomed larger. The water around it was a clutter of wake and spray. Planes on deck had already been launched and recovered earlier in the morning, some being readied for further strikes. Sailors scurried. Bombs and torpedoes were handled where they could not often be in wartime formation. The deck was a city in motion. At approximately 800 yards from Akagi, as the B-26s made their low runs, the torpedoes were released. The weapon's arc and entry into the water mattered. Too high or too shallow and the torpedo would broach or break its guidance. Too slow and it would fail to arm or run with proper depth. Releasing a torpedo from a medium bomber a few hundred feet above the surface was not a trivial adaptation. The timing had to be exact. Then came the flyover. The bomber, after releasing, did not bank away. Instead, Muri's aircraft pulled in close, keeping the fuselage nearly parallel with the carrier's flight deck. For roughly 3 seconds, Suzie Q cleared the horizon of bowsprit and island and was level with the deck at masthead height. From that vantage, the pilot could have easily seen the small figures on the carrier. From the deck, the bomber would have filled the air, a massive, thunderous silhouette, moving faster than anything sailors normally saw at that altitude. 3 seconds. The world can rearrange itself in 3 seconds. Men on Akagi stared. Gunners tracked and fired where their arcs allowed. In some sectors, gunners opened up, their rounds cutting lines through air toward the bomber. Others dropped flat as pieces of deck rigging clipped the air above them. Reports later would show that Japanese anti-aircraft did engage and that the escorting fighters and deck guns exacted a toll on the attackers. 2 B-26s from the torpedo group were lost in the engagement. Across the 2 lost aircraft and the broader attacks that day, 14 men were killed. Records do not support the notion that Japanese forces were unable to fire. What happened was subtler. The bomber's presence at that altitude and angle, combined with the crowded, tangled reality of flight decks in the moment, put some guns in positions where firing risked killing one's own men or damaging planes already on deck. The sight of a heavy bomber so close had psychological weight, and that weight affected decision-making. The Marauder's body took punishment in return. During that pass and the preceding approach, bullets tore into skin and metal. Instruments that had been taken for granted failed in quick succession. Hydraulics that moved flaps and brakes, electrical systems that fed radios and gauges, structural rivets that held panels together. Shrapnel and slugs punched through control surfaces. The port engine began to cough. Sparks traced along wiring. Yet the aircraft kept flying, driven by momentum and dogged hands on the controls. Minihook. The math was brutal. The odds worse. Reports from the men who returned described the plane after the run as a sieve. When Suzie Q finally limped back to Midway hours later, maintainers counted 506 holes in the fuselage and skin. That raw number, 506, isn't just a statistic. It's a map of where the sky turned hostile. The cowling, the wing roots, the tail, the radio compartment.
The count recorded by ground crews confirmed what those who saw the plane come in already suspected. This was a machine that had been shaped, savaged, and still flown home. But at the moment of the flyover, the concern was immediate survival. A run that bold invited concentrated counterfire. Crewmen were hit. On board the bomber, some gunners were struck. The bombardier's position took shrapnel. Instruments went dark. Yet tasks that mattered now could not be postponed. The gunner on the waist might have to get up and move into a different position to bring another gun to bear. The co-pilot might have to crawl aft to tend a wound or manipulate a jammed crank. The manual landing gear crank, a device crews trained to use when hydraulics failed, would have to be readied if a return to Midway involved compromised systems. The physicality of those maneuvers is easy to imagine and hard to overstate. Imagine a man crawling across an aircraft's floor to reach a heavy iron crank. His hands slip on blood and oil. He braces himself against the rumble of a wounded engine. Each turn of that crank takes minutes. Each minute stretches like a rope between life and the ocean. In many bombers, the gear has to be ratcheted down against spring tension. It's work that requires both strength and breath control, the kind of exertion that men in training practice in simulated calm. In combat, it is blood and thunder. Which leads to the strategic dimension. Why, even without scoring a torpedo hit, would such a risky, seemingly futile run matter? Historians debate lines of causation. The safe, modest claim is this: the B-26 attacks that morning, including Suzie Q's pass, helped create a set of pressures on Nagumo and his staff. The presence of American aircraft, the reports of bombs and torpedoes in the water, and the fear of further strikes influenced how the carriers handled their own air group. Aircraft were being rearmed and refueled topside. Bombs and torpedoes were concentrated near fuel lines and decks. Nagumo's staff was forced into a rapid sequence of decisions, whether to launch another strike on Midway with already armed planes, whether to recover or rearm what they had, and how to posture the fleet for the possibility of additional American carrier strikes. The decisions on a carrier deck happen in minutes, sometimes seconds. A recall order, a rearming instruction, a scramble for fighters, each has immediate consequences for how decks are stacked and what combustible items are exposed. Those consequences are not linear. A bomber's close pass can create confusion, the type that multiplies the logistical hazards of loading ordnance. By mid-morning, the fleet would find itself with aircraft, bombs, and fuel in compromising positions. An hour after the B-26's attack wave, dive bombers from the United States Navy found carriers that had been put into an exposed configuration. The dive bombers' success, striking concentrated decks full of live ordnance and fueled aircraft, was brutal and decisive. But it was not the inevitable result of any single event. It was the result of a chain of actions, of multiple attacks, of reporting and misreporting, of choices under uncertainty. The B-26s tended to one link in that chain. He had one engine and a choice: turn away or aim toward the ship. Back on Suzie Q, the flyover had given way to the job of escape. The port engine's decline was not just an inconvenience, it changed the aircraft's flight dynamics. A medium bomber designed to climb on both engines now had to be flown on one across 150 miles of open ocean, with enemy fighters still in the vicinity and with systems that had been compromised. That island in the middle of the Pacific, Midway, had a single runway and a limited margin for error. Landing with a single engine, with a landing gear that might not lock down automatically, and with a main tire that could have been shredded by flak, would be a test of endurance and improvisation. There were crucial, unglamorous tasks to be performed. Someone had to tend wounded hands. Someone else had to secure loose equipment so it would not shift in turbulence. The pilot had to manage fuel mixtures and propeller pitch to eke every knot of speed out of the remaining engine. The navigator had to keep the compass bearing true.
The radio operators, if their sets still broadcasted, had to signal the island with what they had. When systems finally failed, the crew had to be ready for manual procedures that separate sailors from heroes only by the narrowest of margins. And yet, amid those mechanical and medical dramas, the strategic picture continued to evolve far beyond the bomber's own horizon. On Akagi, Nagumo and his staff observed a group of American aircraft attacking at low altitude. They welcomed conflicting reports and took action that morning that would later be seen as pivotal. Planes were moved, ordnance shifted, decisions were made to rearm certain aircraft for another strike. The rearm and the turnover of decks created the kind of vulnerability that dive bombers would later exploit. But again, that is a conditional statement. It is a recognition that in war, small acts amplify each other under pressure. What seemed tactically pointless helped create a strategic opening. The human ledger of that morning is sparse and sharp. 2 B-26s were lost from the attack group. In the broader tally of that morning's air assaults and counter-assaults, 14 men were killed in those lost aircraft. Lives were extinguished in seconds, recorded in logs and later folded into the columns of casualty lists. Others came back badly wounded, their planes crisscrossed with holes. Suzie Q would land with over 500 damaged points recorded on her skin.
The nameplate that had been bolted to her nose would be saved. The airframe itself would be scrapped. The men who survived would be recommended for honors, distinguished service crosses, and other citations that tried, in small brass letters, to make sense of deeds executed under hellish conditions. At the same time, administrators and commanders back on the island and on the carriers had to make quick sense of the tactical picture. Intelligence was imperfect. Radio reports crossed and recrossed. A report that a torpedo had struck a carrier might be filed, then contradicted. The fleet's commander had to balance the risk of remaining in position with the possibility that enemy carriers lurked beyond the horizon. Vice Admiral Nagumo's choices that morning to prepare a strike, to recover and rearm aircraft, to shift ordnance, were made under the pressure of fragmentary information, sightlines obstructed by smoke and mist, and the ever-present noise of the sea and engines. Sailors and airmen side by side would later tell the story in pieces. A mechanic who ran a wrench to strip a plug, a medic who counted breathing, an officer who scribbled damage reports with shaking hands. These small human acts stitched together the immediate aftermath. They also began to form the raw material of later analysis. Why had certain guns not fired at certain times? Had the close pass deterred some crews from opening their mounts because of risk to aircraft on deck? Had the shock of seeing a heavy bomber in that position created hesitation at the command level? These are the fine grains of military history, questions that should be asked with the same care the men had when loading ordnance into an aircraft hold. The consequences of those questions would unfold through the day. For now, though, the narrative clings to a single image, a marauder that crossed the top of a carrier at mast height, a silver streak against gray, a roar that chased sailors to the deck and gunners to their mounts. For Suzie Q's crew, the episode stretched into hours of cramped, precise survival work. For the fleet, it was one of many inputs into decisions that would either expose or protect them from the strikes to come. If there is a moral in such a morning, it is not a tidy one. Courage is visible, consequences are diffuse. One plane flying low could not by itself sink carriers. It could, however, prod a set of reactions that multiplied into outcomes. The line between tactical failure and strategic effect is often fuzzy. A mission can return with no hits and still change an enemy's behavior in ways that favor later attacks. That ambiguity is part of what military historians debate, and it is part of the sober admiration with which we remember the men who strapped into machines not designed for the job and did it anyway.
If this story sounds like it needs to be seen,
That's how the channel helps keep these moments alive. If this account is connecting with you, take a moment to like the video. It helps surface history that might otherwise be shelved. For now, the sky over Midway remained noisy with smoke and engines. Suzie Q had survived the low pass. Her gauges were failing, her skin perforated by shrapnel. The men inside had to choose between nursing a crippled plane home or making a forced landing that might kill them. There is no mythic answer. There is a moment of decision. The pilot banked westward, the island's silhouette growing. Behind them, the carrier group receded into a field of black smoke and motionless silhouettes. Ahead lay 150 miles of ocean, the long, vulnerable line back to the only friendly strip within range. Across the water, American dive bombers and the rest of the strike packages were still finding targets and being found in turn. For Suzie Q, the run across the carrier's deck was the fulcrum. It was a physical feat, a choice to fly level and close rather than break off and run, a decision that put the crew into direct risk for 3 seconds that would be remembered for decades. For the Japanese fleet, the presence of American aircraft at low altitude and the necessity to manage aircraft and ordnance on deck combined into a set of tactical choices that would, in time and in combination with other actions, leave them exposed. The bomber stumbled on. Alarms blinked and failed. One engine smoked. On the floor, a man braced the manual landing gear crank, readying for a return where the runway would demand a perfect landing at a speed far higher than most pilots preferred. Beyond survival and statistics, the men had a second ledger to consider: honor, duty, the hope that a battered plane might still bring them home. The ocean slid beneath in an endless pattern. The island ahead seemed both impossibly distant and absolutely necessary. The day's real verdicts were not yet in. The key questions: could Suzie Q make it back? How badly would the port engine hold? What further decisions would Nagumo make as smoke and confusion thickened his horizons, hung in the air like spent tracer? The bomber limped on. The port engine coughed, then smoked, then settled into a thready, unreliable rhythm. Gauges fluttered, radios whispered and then died. In the fuselage, men moved with the slow, deliberate motions of those who know what must be done next. Secure loose gear, bind wounds, check the remaining engine's temperature. They had flown 150 miles on a single reliable power plant, a stretch that for a medium bomber with hydraulic and electrical systems compromised felt like crossing an ocean twice over. The manual landing gear crank was heavy and slow, a primitive lever that demanded steady hands and breath control. One crew member set his feet and began the long turns, ratcheting the mechanism against springs and damaged linkages. Each full rotation of the handle dropped the gear a little further. Each rotation was a decision to trust metal and muscle over hydraulics. A damaged main tire, the left one had been shot away by flak during the attack, made the eventual touchdown an exercise in concentration. If the strut failed or the remaining tire blew, there would be no margin. Midway's strip came into view like a promise. The island's outline was still narrow, but it was the only strip within range. The pilot ran checklists from memory. The co-pilot monitored headings and trimmed the controls to counter asymmetric thrust. Touchdown speed for a Marauder under such conditions could run toward 150 miles per hour, fast for the era and unforgiving for a scarred one-engine approach. The approach itself was a negotiation with wind and the damaged airframe, flap settings, trim, power, the crab to keep the wounded wing from dropping. They lined up. The runway rushed up under them. The landing was not a gentle kiss, but an urgent, controlled crash. The aircraft touched at high speed, the remaining main tire taking the load, the tail wheel biting into rough pavement, brakes sparking as the damaged systems strained to respond. The momentum pumped down the runway. When the Marauder finally came to a stop, there were only about 800 feet of runway left, a narrow margin by any measure. Men inside exhaled. Some collapsed, Some sat in stunned silence, and then the island's personnel swarmed to assist. The count that followed was clinical and astonishing. Ground crews and ordnance men crawled over the airframe in the bright island sun and tallied hole after hole. 506 was the number recorded. Bullet holes and shrapnel perforations that mapped a path of where the sky had been hostile. The skin around the nose and upper fuselage was peppered. The wings bore scars and torn panels. Rivets were sheared. Control surfaces had been dented and punctured. Radios and instruments lay shattered in places. Hydromic tanks and lines had taken hits. The nose plate, the polished metal that once read Suzie Q, had been stripped off and kept aside. The plane itself would not fly again. The airframe was later scrapped. The nameplate would be preserved. Medical tents filled as wounded were triaged. Some injuries were blunt and bloody. Others were puncture wounds from fragments that had not, mercifully, reached vital organs. On the island, medics worked with the urgency practiced in years of drills. Men who might otherwise have died were saved by quick attention. Others were not so fortunate in other aircraft that morning. Across the torpedo group and the broader attacks, 14 men were counted killed in the 2 B-26s that were lost. Flags were lowered, lists were compiled, and telegrams were sent. The immediate aftermath on Midway was also administrative. Pilots and crews were debriefed in succession. Technicians traced electrical faults and noted hydraulic failures. Intelligence officers interviewed survivors to reconstruct approach vectors, altitudes of release, enemy fighter activity, and anti-aircraft patterns. The reports were cross-referenced with sightings from the island and with other strike packages in the area. The basic sequence emerged clearly. Torpedoes released at roughly 800 yards. A daring close pass along Akagi's deck at masthead height for about 3 seconds. Concentrated anti-aircraft response in sectors where firing arcs allowed. 2 B-26s lost. The surviving Suzie Q returned with extensive damage and wounded men aboard. Recommendations for honors were put forward. The action, flying a machine ill-suited for torpedo attack into the teeth of a carrier force, coming back crippled rather than lost, was not judged by commanders as mere bravado. Men were cited for duty well performed under extraordinary hazard. The official paperwork noted acts of skill and perseverance rather than theatrical heroics. Among those notations were nominations for the Distinguished Service Cross and other commendations sensitive to the context of the mission. Awards and citations try, in small formal language, to translate risk into record. But the record's most consequential pages were not those filled out on Midway. They were the logbooks of decision-making on Nagumo's flagship and the visual reports racing across the radio networks. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's staff, already balancing recovery and rearming cycles, now faced new inputs. Sightings of low-altitude attackers, torpedo tracks in the water, and repeated reports that American planes were in the area. The presence of torpedoes and low attackers produced a single operational imperative for any carrier: manage the deck and the air group to avoid catastrophic fires and to be ready either to launch or to recover as the situation demanded. That imperative, paradoxically, produced new exposure. Aircraft were being rolled topside, ordnance handled in hurried sequences, and fuel lines run at angles that put combustible material in proximity to armed bombs and torpedoes. Men and planes, in turn, were placed into a configuration that meant a single, well-placed set of bombs could ignite a chain reaction. It was not that any one B-26 had created the vulnerability. Rather, the accumulation of attacks, limited information, and rapid decisions pushed the carriers into a posture where a later attack could yield catastrophic effect. Late morning, U.S. Navy dive bombers, having located the Japanese carriers, found them in a state that magnified the damage they could inflict. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown made steep, near-vertical approaches that delivered ordnance directly onto decks crowded with fueled, armed aircraft. The results were swift and devastating. In minutes, 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were fatally struck, burning and sinking in a matter of hours. The precision of those dive bomber attacks and the configuration of the decks combined to produce the decisive, visible outcome of the day. Historians assess the interplay of causes with caution. The low-level attacks that morning, including the B-26 runs, were among the inputs that helped shape the condition of the fleet when the dive bombers arrived. On the command level, interpretations vary. Some argue that the psychological pressure of seeing American aircraft at low altitude forced a set of rapid, risk-laden decisions. Others point to miscommunications, timing errors, and the inherent danger of handling ordnance topside as the principal causes. The modest, document-grounded position is that the B-26 attacks contributed to the chain of events that left the carriers vulnerable. They were part of a broader sequence: torpedo attacks, dive actions, fighter engagements, reconnaissance updates, and command decisions that produced a catastrophic result for the Imperial Japanese Navy that day. Back on Midway, the men of Suzie Q faced the slow, practical aftermath of survival. Maintenance crews photographed and cataloged damage. The nose plate was removed and cataloged. The aircraft itself would be condemned. Medical officers documented injuries. The men wrote concise reports of altitudes and release distances. The bomber's log captured minute details that, in aggregate, would feed both formal histories and the oral memories of those who had been there. Some names: First Lieutenant James Jimmy Murray, Second Lieutenant Pran Moore, Second Lieutenant Russell Johnson, Staff Sergeant John Gogoy, Corporal Frank Malo, and Private Earl Ashley, were entered into official reports and later citations. Those pages would be read and reread by historians and relatives. The human toll beyond the statistics was present in quiet ways. Letters home carried a different weight. Wartime correspondents tried to be both truthful and reassuring. Wounded men convalesced on the island before being shipped to rear medical facilities. Those who remained were given tasks as soon as they could bear them, helping unload returns, speaking to intelligence officers, or simply keeping watch with a new sense of the fragility of each sortie. A soldier's life stitched back into service is a story told in small acts. The man who replaces a torn control cable, the medic who sutures a wound, the pilot who cleans the blood from a windscreen before the next mission. Recognition came, both formal and informal. Commanders wrote letters recommending awards. Fellow airmen told stories that preserved the image of a heavy bomber sliding across a carrier deck at mast height. The silver noseplate of Suzie Q moved from operational artifact to relic. Preserved behind glass in later years, it served as a concrete reminder of what had been risked that morning. The scrap of metal and the patched photographs connected future generations to a single dangerous choice: to fly toward an enemy that outgunned them and to try to come home. The ripple effects of that morning's actions extended beyond individual honors. Strategically, Midway would mark a turning point in the Pacific War. The loss of carriers and trained air crews was a blow from which the Japanese Navy struggled to recover. The United States Navy, by contrast, preserved the sea lanes from immediate threat and seized momentum. To see that outcome as the product of a single plane's run, however cinematic as that run was, would be to oversimplify. The B-26's torpedo attacks helped contribute to a cumulative operational picture that favored the American dive bombers an hour later, but the overall result was the product of many actions converging in a short space of time. Technically, the Suzie Q episode is also instructive. It demonstrates how aircraft designed for one role are sometimes repurposed in desperate circumstances. how human skill and improvisation can extend an aircraft's survival past what designers intended, and how small technical details, landing gear cranks, prop feathering procedures, torque on a failing engine can separate life from death. The Marauder's wing loading and control sensitivities demanded constant attention. Those characteristics were part of why the plane had performed both violently and admirably during the run. The fact that a B-26 could make a torpedo run at all, that it could survive the stress of low altitude, heavy ordnance, and concentrated anti-aircraft fire long enough to get its crew home, speaks to the seam of competence that pilots, co-pilots, and crews sewed into each mission. There is also a moral complexity in assessing such actions. The mission produced no confirmed torpedo hits on the carriers from the B-26 runs. Tactically, it did not sink ships. 2 B-26s were lost and 14 men killed in the broader torpedo attacks that morning, real and measurable costs. Yet the attack's strategic footprint was non-zero. It helped create conditions that the U.S. Navy's dive bombers later exploited. The border between tactical failure and strategic utility is blurred in war. Missions can fail to achieve their immediate objectives while still altering an enemy's behavior in consequential ways. As the years passed, the story of Suzie Q and her crew found its place in museums, family albums, and military histories. The noseplate behind glass is not an abstract trophy. It is a hinge to an event that combined daring, damage, and decision. Some members of the crew survived the war and entered civilian life. Others continued in military service for varying periods. Citations recognized the courage under fire displayed by those aboard Suzie Q and within the torpedo group. Historians would return to the day's sequence repeatedly, parsing pilot reports, Japanese logs, and action reports for the fine grains of causality. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's name, too, entered the annals of military study as an example of command under duress. His decisions, made under ambiguous information, smoke, fragmented sightings, and the immediacy of attack, have been judged in many lights. Some critiques emphasize the tactical consequences of deck handling. Others focus on the fog of war and the operational limits of carrier warfare of the era. The debate is part of the larger study of Midway, a campaign where reconnaissance, timing, technology, and human judgment collided with historic consequence. When the noise of that day recedes in memory, what remains are human ledger entries. Men sat at their stations and did the tasks they had been trained to perform. Others improvised when systems failed. They traded danger for outcomes they could not fully foresee. The battered aircraft that landed with 506 holes was, in a sense, a ledger that recorded where danger had intersected with fidelity to duty. The final pages of the story are the quiet ones. The Suzie Q nameplate, once part of a serviceable aircraft, became a preserved object. The machine it had been taken from was scrapped. The men who returned readjusted to the rhythms of life as service members. They attended to duty, to recovery, to paperwork, and to the slow, aching business of bearing witness. Where loss occurred, families grieved. Where life remained, years unfolded, with the strange combination of memory and ordinary errands that marks survivors' years. If there is a lesson beyond commemoration, it is the stubborn complexity of wartime cause and effect. A single act, a low pass, a torpedo release, a manual crank under duress, rarely equals a single historical verdict. Instead, moments accumulate. They press on decision-makers, alter timings, complicate logistics, and create openings or close them. Courage matters. So does timing. So does information. The B-26 that slid along Akagi's flight deck for 3 seconds did not do something that alone decided the battle. But it did something that morning. It forced observations, required responses, and helped shape a sequence of choices that would, in combination with other factors, leave the powerful Japanese carrier force exposed to a later, devastating blow. Respecting the balance between drama and fact is part of remembering. Men flew into danger with imperfect machines and improvised training. Some came back to tell the tale, and others did not. The historical record insists that we treat both outcomes with sober attention. We recognize the tactical costs and the strategic complexities without turning sacrifice into mythic inevitability. Today, the preserved instruments, the nose plate behind glass, and the names in the records serve as touchstones.
Museums and memorials keep the details from fading. They invite reflection on what individuals did under impossible circumstances. If you find yourself moved by this account, consider that stories like these are carried by families and by institutions that preserve wartime artifacts. Visit a museum, read the after-action reports, or if you are connected to a veteran's personal story, share it in the comments so these lives and choices remain in the public memory. We close with a simple tribute to First Lieutenant James Murray and the men of Suzie Q, to those who did not return, and to the countless sailors and airmen whose decisions and deeds, large and small, shaped a critical day in the Pacific. Their courage was not a guarantee. Their missions were not always successful in the narrow tactical sense, but their willingness to act under fire helped, in ways both clear and subtle, to shape history. If this account moved you, consider sharing a story of a veteran in your life, or visiting the museum exhibits that hold the silver plate and the names. Their memory is the truest measure of what was risked that morning over the Pacific.